I'm Shlomi. I lead the Cloud Resilience Go-to-Market. I'm joined by Christina Yakomin, Senior Resilience Architect at Vanguard. Today we are going to talk about practices to manage your application and risk with continuous resilience. Why customers invest in resilience from the first place? So resilience equals revenue, that's what Gartner said, and according to IDC, Fortune 1000 company lost between 1.5 and 2.5 billion due to unplanned system downtime. And in addition to the direct loss of revenue, there is also brand associated with that, brand impact. Like security, resilience is a shared responsibility between AWS and the customer. AWS is responsible for the resilience of the cloud, all the services we provide, and what customer build on top is the customer responsibility. AWS, and the more the systems are complex, there are more challenges to ensure resiliency. With the adoption of microservices, observability become more complex, and there are variations between deployments. There are multiple components for each application, and the more complexity, it make it harder to anticipate failure. In AWS, most of our services have resilience component. If you think about our database services, which have native multi-AZ and optional multi-region features, almost every service in AWS have a resilience feature embedded into it. And on top of that, we have built a number of services that help you to assess and test the resilience of your application, which we will focus on in the next few slides. So I just want to make the mental model shift between what we call foundational resilience, which are the pieces that embedded in each and every AWS service, to the services that help you to monitor and assess resilience and recover from failure. On a brief overview, we have AWS Resilience Hub that helps you analyze components of your application and ensure that your application meets your predefined RTO and RPO. You have AWS Fault Injection Service, which is AWS tool to run chaos testing on your architecture, managed chaos with lots of safety tools. We have AWS Elastic Disaster Recovery and AWS Backup, and Route 53 Application Recovery Controller that can help you recover more quickly if we anticipate any degradation on an AZ or in a regional service. And of course, we have lots of solutions provided to you in the solutions library. Customers have asked us for guidance. How should they build programs around ensuring continuous resilience? In October last year, slightly before reInvent, we launched the AWS Resilience Lifecycle that provides tools and mechanisms to ensure continuous resilience. This white paper is available in our website. The key outcome, we have very limited time, so I'll just focus on the key outcomes is to identify priorities. Once you set a predefined objectives for each application, it's much easier for you to work on prioritization, to build better operational practices, and gather learnings from mitigation of events. Let's go through it step by step. And I do want to mention that not all stages need to be done at one point. You can run through them quickly and with a shallow pass, and then go into each one of them more deeply as your team finds appropriate. And that resilience lifecycle should be run on a workload by workload basis. So it's not resilience lifecycle for your company, rather it's a resilience lifecycle for each one of your applications. Let's practice each step. The first step is to set objectives. It's very hard to meet your objectives when you have never defined them. So the first stage is about workload prioritization and tiering and setting up the objectives. We refer to objectives as RTO and RPO. RTO is recovery time objective and RPO is recovery point objectives, which stands for how much data do I accept to lose in the case of an outage. So once you set up the objectives, and I want to emphasize that setting up the objectives is not the role only of the technical team. This is a decision that the business team is heavily invested in, right? When you think about the objectives, there are so many trade-offs from cost to complexity that you shouldn't say, hey, that's the problem of the technical team. You need to really have a discussion with your business teams. It can be the product team or the project manager that understand the cost implication and can weigh in when you have those trade-off discussions. So setting up the objective is really key. At this stage, you also define what are the objective metrics that will be defined later on in stage 2 and 4. Once we have the objectives, it's much easier. By the way, we also have the lens of what AWS has to provide you on the setting objectives. There is no service, quote unquote, that help you set up the objectives, but I would mention that AWS Resilience Hub allows you to define those objectives after you have decided them. So the process is that you define the application and then define the objectives that you chose for that application. Now, after you have set up the objective, it's easier to design and implement, and that's the point that you decide, for example, whether you are going to use backup, disaster recovery, or both, based on your RTO and RPO objectives. Use all the variety of AWS foundational resilience features that are embedded in our services, work on the dependency mapping, and basically start defining and developing your application and cloud infrastructure. As you have gained some development, it's time to think about testing. In design and implement, you can see that there is a large number of services that you will consider, including the one I mentioned before. Once you started developing, not necessarily when you are done, but if you have something that you can test, this is the time to run evaluate and tests. And the services you can use with AWS are Resilience Hub that run static tests on your infrastructure and can tell you if there are any concern about inability to meet your predefined RTO and RPO. You have Fault Injection Service with the concept we launched called Scenario. For example, Scenario would be AZ availability power interruption. Simulate me an AZ power outage, which will help you simulate that event and see if your application can sustain it. I'll run quickly because I'm running out of time. So test and evaluate is very important, and this testing doesn't end here, right? So it's throughout your development. The next step would be to operate, building your observability and metrics and running synthetic traffic, setting up the alarms, operational reviews, and run load testing. The next step would be The next step would be to take learnings, respond and learn, apply auto-remediation for events that you have identified, and set up the escalation path. And that's a cycle, so it's going back to set up objectives. At this point, I want to invite Christina to talk about customer story from Vanguard. Thank you.
Thank you, Shlomi. So now I'm going to talk to you about how we implement continuous resilience testing at Vanguard. For those of you who aren't familiar with Vanguard, we are a financial services company, one of the largest investment companies in the world, offering a large selection of low-cost mutual funds. We're headquartered here in Pennsylvania, in Malvern, just about an hour down the regional rail. We lovingly refer to our headquarters as halfway between Wall Street and US East 1. We've been in operation since 1975, and though we are supported by crew around the globe, we have no brick and mortar locations where we interact directly with our clients, which means that the resiliency of our software systems, our web channel, is critically important to the operations of Vanguard as a company. Today, the way that Vanguard is operating is in a poly-cloud, multi-region environment. We're leveraging multiple cloud providers, not just AWS, to support our infrastructure across multiple regions around the globe because of our global client base and our high criticality resiliency needs. We also have multiple data centers where we are partnering for co-located hosted workloads for that global operating model. But we haven't always been this way, of course. We didn't make the decision to adopt the public cloud until 2015. So less than 10 years ago, we started this migration. We had a very ambitious modernization agenda to get ourselves to this multi-region poly-cloud environment. And because we moved so quickly, that created that very complex distributed environment that Shlomi was talking about. Very, very complicated, difficult to manage. So what that means is that we did see an increase in instability and ultimately a degraded client experience, which is not what we want. So we needed continuous resilience to help us improve that experience for our clients. We developed a new operating model. We went from a reactive model to a proactive model, integrating continuous resilience into every step of the software development lifecycle. You saw the cycle that Shlomi introduced previously. We've adopted that as well, with resilient standards and patterns, architecture and design principles, deployments and automated checks, validation and operation through our telemetry, and then, of course, recovery and realignment in the case of incident response. We focused on building some homegrown tools to further enable our adoption of resilience. In my role, I am the head of architecture for our resiliency architecture and testing department, where we support these homegrown tools, including PTAS. That's Performance Testing as a Service. We built it out in AWS on top of the Locust framework. And this was important because it allowed us to democratize the practice of performance testing. Previously, in a not so distributed environment, we had dedicated performance testers testing our monolithic applications. But they couldn't keep up with the scale and complexity of our distributed environment. So we needed every single team to find a way to performance test their own applications on a continuous basis as that number of applications continued to rise. And PTAS was our way of accomplishing that. We also introduced our own homegrown tool for fault injection called the Climate of Chaos, lovingly dubbed so with its weather theme, because we want to make sure that our applications can weather any storm in production. So this application, this predates the Amazon Fault Injection Service. It has a bunch of homegrown experiments, as well as some built on top of some open source frameworks. But as we look forward to the future, we're planning on using the pre-built Climate of Chaos as a wrapper around some of the Fault Injection Service offerings, so that we can expand our suite of experiments that Vanguard engineers can run. Next up, we of course have observability across our stack, logs, metrics, and traces, often implemented with open telemetry, and of course tools to help us visualize across all three of those telemetry types. We also have observability into how we're doing in terms of continuous resilience and performing those resiliency activities. We've implemented a policy engine that runs as part of every continuous integration build. This is going to tell our teams whether or not they are complying with our recommended standards for resiliency activities, like performing a performance test or injecting faults into their application. And that evaluation is going to be based on things like the criticality of their application and the platform where their application is running. Finally, we also have an enterprise health check dashboard, another implementation of observability where we're surfacing those most critical metrics for our most critical services that our business and IT leaders alike are going to care about. This gives us a one-stop shop to understand the current state of affairs for everything that is most critical to us, and then also allows us to double-click into any areas that look like they may need some additional attention. And as a result of all of this, alongside organizing ourselves for resilience and standing up a resiliency org to support all of this, we've seen some major resiliency wins in the past few years. We've enhanced reliability and continuity for our clients. This next bullet point is the thing that I am most proud of in the work that we've done these past few years. We have accelerated feature delivery by 5x while reducing failures by 30%. That is so impressive and exciting to me. We've implemented proactive event detection that has also decreased incident recovery time by about 60%. So not only are we failing less frequently, we're recovering from those failures more quickly. So obviously this is going to result in increased availability, reliability, and recoverability, and ultimately an improved client experience and higher client satisfaction. And that's been reflected in our client satisfaction metrics as well. So now let's talk about what is next for us. I mentioned the adoption of something like AWS Fizz. We plan to continue easing the adoption of resilient libraries and resilience tools. One of the ways that we're going to do that is by improving the availability of programmatic consumption of our tools by exposing APIs internally at Vanguard so that folks can write their own scripts to schedule experiments or performance tests to run whenever they'd like. And we're also integrating our tools together. Just this year, we allowed the integration of our PTAS, performance testing tool, and our Climate of Chaos tool so that engineers at Vanguard can click one button, start their performance test, and then after a specified duration, inject a fault as well, so that you can observe the result of that injected fault under steady load. We're going to continue integrating additional observability platforms and constantly looking for the latest and greatest in observability tooling so that we always have a good idea of how our systems are behaving at any given time. We, of course, also want to build onto that policy engine that I mentioned. Having that policy engine foundation layer allows us to add new policies and change them all the time now that it's there. So we see tons of potential to continue growing and surfacing information directly to teams about how they're doing relative to their peers and relative to the recommendations that we're providing. Finally, we will, of course, continue to evolve the resiliency practices for client journeys alongside the rest of the industry and keep an eye on what new innovations come up in the resiliency space. With that, I think I've left a few minutes for questions, but if you want to scan this QR code, this will take you to some more information about the continuous resilience lifecycle that Shlomi shared from AWS. Thank you once again. I really appreciate you all, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.